Thanks for joining this 3Keel webinar. We've designed this to help you with the implementation of the European Union's deforestation-free regulation. So just some introductions to begin. I'm Roisin McDermott-Casement. I'm a consultant at 3Keel and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'm joined today by my colleagues Will Schreiber and Anna Kitulagoda, who will be speaking today about the EU due diligence requirements. Just to quickly note, the regulation is still in draft form. Given it's completed the trilogue process, we don't expect major changes, but some minor amendments are possible. This webinar is an overview based on our interpretation of requirements, and it shouldn't be relied upon to give full detail of the legal obligations. Just before we get started, to let you know the session will be recorded and be sent to you afterwards along with the slides. We're really keen to hear from you. We'll have a 20-minute Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And as we go, please just post any questions you have in the Q&A box. And finally, just to note, the webinar is being held under the Chatham House rule. So some of you on the call today will be familiar with 3Keel and what we do. But just to quickly recap, we're an Oxford-based sustainability consultancy. We have 7 practice areas. Those are sustainable commodities, climate change, resilient agriculture, landscape innovation, circular economy, bespoke research, and our newly launched nature and biodiversity practice area. And the webinar today is being hosted by our Sustainable Commodities team. Now, we're pleased to say we've been rated by the Financial Times as a leading management consultancy for sustainability for 5 years running. And most recently, we're delighted to have received a silver rating in the 2023 sustainability category. To give you an overview of how complex this area is, soft commodities are a really complex system, and this overlaps with our work in other practice areas, such as resilient agriculture, nature and biodiversity, and landscape innovation. And we identify multiple sustainability challenges within these areas. So firstly, there's a clear power imbalance throughout the supply chain, and this means the ability to leverage change varies considerably between different actors. And we see solutions as needing to account for these and also for cross-sector alignment in necessary to deliver that successful change. Now, it isn't necessarily helpful that at the same time as we see private sector actors coming together, we're also experiencing a period of development and trade policy divergence between high production and consumption regions. Combined with this, there's real challenges in facing to secure supply within changing climate conflict. Trade barriers and long-term perspectives and investment need to be balanced alongside flexibility and agility. Now, whilst all these factors are going on in the background, our focus today for this webinar is on one policy that aims to address a single issue, that being deforestation. Now, we see production and consumption as a complex system, and we recognize the need to work on both parts of the system, both individually and collectively. We do this in a number of ways. Firstly, we perform detailed research and analysis projects that includes risk assessments and helping clients to devise strategies and policies, as well as ambitious pathways. Secondly, we help our clients and their suppliers to build capacity and understanding, as well as collecting and interpreting data as parts of projects to map their commodity supply chains. We see collaboration as essential to solve these sustainability challenges, and we facilitate innovation at a number of pre-competitive forums. For example, we convene the Retail Soy Group, as well as the Sustainable Seafood Coalition. And just to give you an overview, our sustainable commodity practice operates within these 5 core themes to provide support through capacity building, research and analysis, supply chain mapping, coalition building, And finally, that strategy and risk assessment. Now, as I talk you through the agenda for today, I'm just going to launch a quick poll. And this is to understand which commodities are of interest for you or your organization or your business as we go through the webinar. Now, to go through the agenda for today, Will and Anna are going to take you through the deforestation challenge, as well as the EU response. We'll then take you through the implications for specific commodities, including animal feed and livestock products, as well as suggested actions that you can take going forward. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to leave plenty of time for questions you may have in the Q&A section. So with that, I'm just going to hand over to Anna, and she's going to talk you through the deforestation challenge.
Great, thanks, Roisin, and good morning, everyone. Really nice to see you, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. So I was going to start with just setting a little bit of context really around the new regulation. I think it's helpful to remind ourselves why we are talking about deforestation, why we focus on soft commodities, and therefore understand a bit more about where the regulation has come from, to understand, why it's the shape that it is and how it operates. So really, when we're talking about forests, I think forests has been a sort of a major focus for over a decade now, really. And a lot of that is driven by a recognition of the sheer scale of forest loss that's happening globally, and also the fact that this is happening in some of the in areas which are highly biodiverse. Often there's severe implications for climate change, and so I think the recognition of the fact that when we're talking about the need to try to manage and avert the most dangerous levels of climate change, forests are a really key part of that, both in terms of not acting as a source of emissions and their potential to act as a carbon sink, and the related biodiversity crisis that we're facing, and then the sheer level of dependence that people have on forests for all kinds of different services that they provide. A lot of the research has demonstrated that agricultural expansion is a massive driver of forest loss around the world, in different shapes and forms in different places, but you can't really talk about how we're going to tackle and address deforestation without having a conversation about agriculture and about the production of different commodities and how they're being used and traded around the world. So when we talk about soft commodities, as Roisin was saying, it's really talk about it as a system. And we have a diagram that looks sort of like we refer to as the fish, but it's really trying to understand about how commodities flow through a system, and different parts of that supply chain will look different for the different commodities. But you sort of see some broad similarities as well. You often sort of begin with quite a geographic spread and a diverse spread in terms of actors at the production stages and at some of those intermediate steps of processing, but equally other places where the system becomes quite concentrated, and it's actually quite a small number of actors. So again, referring what Roisin was saying in terms of looking at those leverage points, if we're really trying to shift that system to being more sustainable, how do we do that? From the EU's perspective, there's been much more of a recognition of their role in deforestation as being a large and wealthy market globally. And so there's been various analyses that have been carried out to try to understand the footprint of what the EU is importing, and the impact that that's having in the places where production's occurring and where deforestation's occurring. And there's some, quite significant statistics there in terms of the scale of the impact, the scale of the footprint, and how that relates to particular commodities. So a lot of what we can see from the regulation has emerged. It's from this, these analyses of understanding where is that impact happening and what's causing that impact, which commodities are linked to it. And you can see from looking at the map that the impacts from the EU's consumption are occurring in some of the most biodiverse and climate-rich forests and landscapes around the world. So I think it's an area that's attracted significant attention because of for all of those reasons. So with that sort of context, then looking at what is the EU response basically? How have they decided to try to put this focus on deforestation and taking responsibility? So when we talk about the system, we need to think about both the supply side and the demand side, different actions that can be taken on those to try to sort of shift the system as a whole towards more sustainable and, particularly tackling the deforestation that's occurring in agricultural supply chains. So there's a range of measures that have been considered. The one with the orange box around it is the one that we're mainly talking about today, which is, tackling deforestation linked to EU imports and a regulatory measure. But it is very much seen as, a package of things. The one regulation on its own is not going to solve the issue or address all of the factors. But there's a recognition, I think, that trade levers are really critical. It has to be supply and demand together. Looking only at the supply side is not going to really help make that shift. And from the EU's perspective, the EU timber regulation came into force about a decade ago now. And I think there's a sense that there's been some real successes that came from that regulation, but some lessons. It was also only ever intended to address legality issues, and deforestation, I think, has, as I say, become ever more of a concern for people globally. So you can really see, I think, with the new regulation, the learnings, I suppose, and the efforts to sort of take what the strengths of the EU timber regulation and address some of the loopholes or some of the weaknesses that we had in that regulation. So yeah, the next slide really is just a sort of a summary of that it emerges from this concern for forests, for climate change, for biodiversity loss, for poverty, all of these different reasons, and recognising EU demand as a driver. The EU timber regulation was a really important step forwards in terms of thinking about how you could tackle some of the challenges related to EU supply chains by looking at due diligence, by really requiring businesses to place more scrutiny on the materials that are being imported and what's happened in the countries where they were produced. There's been some partial success, some really great impacts, but also some real gaps, and it was never intended to address deforestation in full. And so now we have what we're referring to as the EUD, i.e. deforestation regulation, which is this new and incoming regulation, broader spread of commodities and deforestation, and, as I say, trying to close some of those loopholes that were weaknesses in the EU timber regulation as well. So the focus is on due diligence, and like I say, that's really about trying to break the link between what's being imported into the EU and the risks of deforestation or illegality in the places where it was produced. So it's about creating an obligation on companies that they need to be looking at their supply chains, understanding where they're sourcing from and the issues associated with the products that they're sourcing and placing on or trading in the EU market. So the requirement is around gathering information, understanding all of these things, understanding deforestation risk and legality, assessing that risk, taking decisions, and then setting out your mitigation actions and then recording that. And the real framing is around reducing risk down to a no or a negligible level. So it really is about, gathering quality information, verifiable information, and then using that to understand risk and then to address risk and bring it right down to those no or negligible levels. So the core elements of the regulation then, so the commodities that are included are the sort of 7 that have been identified as some of the biggest drivers of forest loss, going back to that map, the sort of octopus map that we showed earlier. So it's cattle, cocoa, coffee, oil palm, rubber, soya and wood. And it's various products associated with each of those commodities, which are going to be covered by the regulation. The requirement is going to be for traceability right back to the original site of production, so a plantation, a farm, a forest management unit. It really is a requirement for geolocation, GPS coordinates, polygons, however you want to refer to it. And that information is going to need to stay with the product as it moves through a supply chain. As Rasheen said, the regulation has passed the trial process but hasn't yet been formally finalised and published. We're expecting that to happen within the next couple of months. And then there will be 18 months from when that occurs, when that final publication occurs, for the entry into force. So we're looking at probably late 2024 or the latest would be the start of 2025 for the regulation to come into force. And the really all sort of crux of it is about any of these commodities or their associated products which are placed on the EU market will need to be deforestation free, and that's looking at a cut-off date of the 31st of December of 2020, and it's all deforestation. It's not legal or illegal deforestation, it's all deforestation. There's other aspects of legality, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, and it will need to be covered by a due diligence statement, which is a formal written statement which will need to be submitted by companies to the authorities, and will be published. So those due diligence statements, effectively what they cover is setting out, some information about the company, the HS code, which is the sort of the specific type of product that's being used, whether it's a palm oil product, whether it's paper, whether it's soybeans, the specific product, the quantity that's being brought in, and then this question of the country of production and the precise location where it was produced, and a confirmation that due diligence has been carried out on that product and that no negligible risk of deforestation or illegality has been found. So those due diligence statements, as I say, will need to be sent to authorities. They'll be published. They need to be retained for 5 years. And they need the information in them, and the reference number for those statements will need to be passed on to any customers further down the supply chain, because they're going to have the requirement to basically use the information in terms of the commodity and its location of production in order to carry out their own due diligence and to publish their own due diligence statement. So for a commodity or product, as it moves through a supply chain, there could be multiple due diligence statements that are being published against the same commodity by the different supply chain actors who are handling that particular product. The scope, the way that the definition is framed, the definitions within it are quite broad. So the commodities, as I say, those 7 commodities, the sort of products, I suppose, that are covered by the regulation, they're listed in Annex 1 of the regulation. It would cover the main co-products, the major uses that I could certainly think of when I thought of those different commodities that would come onto the market. Like I say, the definition of legality is quite broad. It covers a range of issues, and there's a particular emphasis that's been put in around questions of community and Indigenous people's rights, and things around free, prior and informed consent, FPIC. Which is really about ensuring that the conversion, I suppose, of that forest originally to a plantation or production site was done legally and with the consultation of all those who are directly impacted by it. There's a concept in the regulation of substantiated concerns, which is essentially a sort of a formal concern of a high risk of deforestation or illegality, which has evidence to back up the concern. They can be raised by anyone, any person could raise them, and they trigger a legal response. So a company that receives a substantiated concern that material in their supply chain has this risk of deforestation or illegality associated with it, they're required to notify the authorities, and they're required to notify their customers as well, in order that action, it can be investigated and that action can be taken by anyone in the supply chain who's impacted, who's handling that material. The regulation has this definition of an operator, which is essentially the first person to place or make available that product, that commodity on the EU market, and a trader, which is basically anyone else who handles it further downstream. Anyone who's familiar with the EU timber regulation, those concepts are probably familiar. The terminology is the same, but in the EU timber regulation, there's quite a big distinction between an operator and a trader. Most of the due diligence obligation effectively sits on the operator, the first one to place on the market, with a trader having a much lighter obligation. In the new regulation, the deforestation regulation, other than for an SME, which again, if it's a trader, would have that lower obligation. But if you're not an SME, effectively you're considered as an operator regardless of where you sit in the supply chain, which means that the requirement for full due diligence and for publishing those due diligence statements would sit on companies regardless of whether they're the first to place that product on the market or not. Some of the core principles are then looking at how the regulation is framed. It has universal application, so all of the it applies across all of the EU countries, across all of the supply chains handling these particular products. The framing of the regulation is around the product, not around sort of where in the EU or which supply chain it's involved in. It's around the sort of nature of the product itself. Due diligence is required to be done wherever the commodity originates. So if it's the soybeans are grown in Germany, or if they're grown in Brazil, the requirement to be able to trace back to those specific polygon coordinates is exactly the same. The due diligence requirements may be lesser if it's considered to be a low risk area, but the requirement for traceability remains. And that's been quite an important principle in terms of complying with World Trade Organization requirements and that kind of thing. There are some targeted simplifications. So as I said, if you're a small and medium enterprise, if you're a trader, i.e. not the first one to place it on the market, but elsewhere in the supply chain, you don't have the full due diligence obligation. But what is really important is that those sort of due diligence statements that have been published against that commodity and those geolocation coordinates effectively remain with that consignment, in order that can then be, that information is sort of remains together and can be used by other actors who are further in the supply chain, who, if they're not SMEs, will again have that full due diligence requirement. And there will be a simplified due diligence process for low risk areas. The European Commission initially classes all countries as medium risk under the regulation, but it will start taking action to classify some areas as high risk and some areas as lower risk. And for low risk, there will be the potential to use a simplified form of due diligence. There's no exemptions to the requirements. So certification, I think, is going to be probably something that's talked about a lot in terms of how people respond to the requirements of the regulation. It's going to be obviously have value in terms of traceability requirements. It's going to have value in terms of understanding the legality checks that have been carried out. But it isn't any sort of silver bullet or, you know, magic solution. If you buy certified material, it's not required to, it's not automatic that it's met the requirements of the regulation. And the requirement of the regulation is that you've done effective due diligence on that. So you could take that certification information into account, but you can't use it to say that no due diligence was required. And then supply chain complexity, that can't be used to justify any sort of lack of due diligence or lack of traceability. It's seen as actually increasing risk. So I think, you know, you can't sort of assume that because it's difficult to trace that would somehow give it an option not to do that traceability. Just to talk again about a little bit about the penalties, that's got some real weight behind the regulation. The specifics of the penalties will be set by the individual EU member states, but the regulation sort of sets out broadly what they could cover, what would be envisaged. And I should say that any penalties that are applied to the name of the company and the types of penalties, that's also going to be published on the EC website. So it's going to become, you know, clear across the EU as to if people have been penalised for not meeting the requirements of the regulation. The types of penalties can be fines, which are significant, up to 4% of an EU-wide turnover. There could be seizure, there can be confiscation of revenues, there could be confiscation of products themselves. There's scope to exclude from public funding or from public procurement contracts, and also stopping people using those simplified due diligence if they're sort of seen to be potentially abusing that system, and for really serious or repeat infringements, there is the potential within the regulation to prohibit a company from importing, trading, placing on the market, exporting that product on the EU market. So that's obviously going to be a sort of particularly serious exclusion. So you see there's real teeth, I suppose, behind the regulation. There's some, you know, serious penalties that could be applied. And as I say, because any information about those would be recorded and made public across the EU, I think, you know, you also would need to think about the reputational damage and costs associated with anyone found to not comply with the regulation. So on that cheery note, just to sort of summarise and go back again, that the bottom line is that basically information is this sort of geospatial and other information is going to need to remain with goods along the supply chain, because the various actors along them, unless they're SMEs, are going to have a full due diligence obligation right up to the point of an end consumer. So it's you know, the requirement is going to be that you carrying out due diligence, but also that you're making the reference numbers of your statements and that geolocation information available to any customers with the products that are being sold, in order that they can carry out those checks. So I think just looking then a bit more about the commodities that are covered. There's 7 commodities in total that are covered. Like I say, there's in Annex 1 of the regulation, it sets out lists of, the specific codes of specific products under each of these commodities that are covered by the regulation, and for where the due diligence and the due diligence statements are going to be required. It covers the major uses. Each of these supply chains obviously does look slightly different. They've all got their own quirks, but there's also some real sort of similarities and parallels across some of the challenges and the issues I think we're going to find. Some of these uses we've highlighted in orange just because they're ones that maybe are a bit, well, the animal feed we'll dig into a bit more in depth. My colleague Will's going to talk a little bit more about that. And on timber and paper, I'd highlighted some of these things around packaging and printed materials like books and magazines, specifically because those were things that were not in scope of the EU timber regulation and were seen as potential loopholes, and so many of those have been closed. The scope for timber and paper products under the new deforestation regulation is slightly broader than it was under the EU timber regulation. So it was just to sort of flag that. In terms of some of the challenges that we can see, some common themes. So traceability obviously is a real question, I think, for all of these commodities. It's something that's been talked about, I think, with all of them to different extents for several years now, but the progress has been sometimes slow, sometimes uneven. It can be really challenging. For some of the commodities, like I think rubber, about 85% of rubber globally is produced by smallholders. So, getting that traceability right back to what could be very small production locations and sites is obviously, it's going to be a massive data gathering exercise. I think some commodities, some supply chains are probably more ready for this than others. But equally, for things like palm oil and timber, where I think there has been, or paper, where there's been an interest in traceability for some years now, but often that's been back to a mill site rather than right back to the forest, which is what's going to be required for the new regulation. So I think there's going to be a lot of work and a lot of focus on that sort of area over the coming years. Certification, as I say, is I think going to be something which a lot of actors are going to look to help with the traceability requirements, with managing and mitigating those risks, understanding what has been assessed on the ground and how that's been assessed, how information is recorded, all those sorts of things. So I think some of those certification standards as well are probably going to be better fits for the regulation in its current form than others. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond over the next 18 months, whether they look to strengthen or amend anything in terms of responding to the regulation. But like I say, I think it's going to be a really useful and important tool, but it isn't a simple answer. It's not a magic solution to what's needed here. And then finally, this question of sort of some of the social and governance issues. Like I say, it's the focus for the name of the regulation has been around the deforestation aspect and tackling deforestation. But there is these wider questions around social and governance issues, and particularly these questions around community consultation, community rights, free prior and informed consent. So I think, again, some commodities have probably done more work on this in the past than others. I think for something like cocoa, there's been quite a lot of discussion around, links with poverty and exploitation and labour rights in supply chains, and possibly actually less focus for them on deforestation. But again, these are going to be difficult issues. I think understanding where you can get reliable information, where you can actually understand and help manage and mitigate those risks. Again, it's going to be something where there will need to be some considerable efforts made, I think, over the next 18 months. I suppose one thing I should say is the intent of this presentation is not to frighten people, to terrify them that there is going to be no supply of these different commodities available. So as I say, deforestation, labour rights issues, all of these sorts of things have actually been talked about for some time now, and all of the commodities that are involved, they're bulk crops, they're being mass produced globally, they're being shipped and traded globally. And actually what we've already seen, I think, is a shift from the European market towards some of the lower risk sources. A lot of the material for some commodities like palm oil, for example, is already certified to standards which should be excluding deforestation and illegality from those supply chains. When we're looking at something like soy, again, I think we can see that a lot of the soy that's coming into the EU, it may be coming from countries where at a country level there is a substantial risk of deforestation for somewhere like Brazil, but actually the specific areas where the European supply is coming from are much lower risk. And so I think the question really going to be is here is it's about the transparency. It's about the ability to evidence that that risk has been made to a negligible or no level of risk at all. It's not that there is a fundamental problem, I suppose, in accessing the supply, but it's about being able to evidence and in order to meet the requirements of the regulation. So I'm going to hand over to Will to dig a bit more into some of the feed and livestock questions.
Thanks, Anna. I think the last point is really important in that we have to keep in mind what the cutoff date is for any deforestation, being the 31st of December 2020. That's only a couple of years ago as well, and yet we've got a commodity system that's been feeding us and providing these materials for a long time and growth of it. So it's really about trying to arrest and halt new deforestation and conversion. So keeping things as they are is consistent with it. So in terms of where the challenges are of getting materials, there's not a historic date. It's a new date, and particularly as we move to these animal feed and livestock products kind of challenges, we can see that it's not a kind of an overnight kind of closing of the tap of what can come here. It's more of the transparency and traceability challenge. Now, animal feed for soy, at least, is the biggest user of these commodities. About 75% of global soy production goes into animal feed. Now, because soy is included within the regulation, it is addressed within animal feed, but it's not going all the way down the supply chain. So essentially what you're going to be seeing, if we start on the left side of the page, is that you'll have verified farms and unverified farms. It doesn't matter if it's one soybean or 50,000 tons of soybeans that's going into a ship. If that soybean's not verified, that entire ship can't come into Europe under the regulation. And the visibility and the transparency to support that polygon traceability is going to be what's necessary for those people first importing it into the product, or what's known as the operators, as well as the non-SME traders. Now, the reason why I've popped a cow on here is because cows are the one thing that are a bit different than this. And in terms of animal feed, with every other livestock group, whether it's a chicken or a pig, once that chicken or pig has consumed that soy, it's no longer considered a commodity in that sense, and therefore there's not actually a direct legal requirement for downstream customers and buyers of that meat to be doing anything in their supply chain. That doesn't mean that reputationally or other areas might still push for transparency, but in terms of the scope of the regulation, it's only regulated products in Annex 1. Now, meat from beef and leather are included in Annex 1. And in that case, there's 2 points of due diligence that have to occur, one of which is going to be on the cow itself. And that is just around the geolocation of where the cow was reared. For feed, it is included and due diligence is required, but you do not have to have farm level visibility of the ingredients going into feed. So if you in effect draw this line between looking at commodity risk versus product risk, the commodity risk is the core part of the European legislation, but there are also products that can be added to Annex 1, but right now it's just cows. Now, part of the challenge for cows on this too is going to be where that visibility goes, because we know that the cattle sector is a bit complicated, because you might have some farms that are just involved in breeding, whereas the ones that are importing into the EU are only going to be buying from the finishing farms or the meat packers or slaughterhouses that are doing the exporting. So some of the nuance involved in the legislation and the interpretation is still to come around this, but the requirement for visibility is going to be a bit of a challenge for many of the processors involved in this. It's not like with soy or with palm oil, where there's just a single farm that's involved in their production. You could have these multiple ones that are involved. So if you do trade in beef or in leather, it's just going back to where the cow was, but you also still have to have that due diligence requirement on the feed itself. So in that sense, if we look at cattle on one side, it looks like that they've got a lot of the requirements, but remember that it's the core commodity that's also in scope of this. So palm oil and soy are both feed components. They are in scope as materials coming into Europe. If you're bringing palm kernel meal or soy meal, those are both regulated commodities under the due diligence requirements. It's just that the due diligence brunt is going to be falling on the importer of those commodities, as well as the non-SME customers that they have downstream. So cattle specifically has been drawn out because of its focus and connection, particularly as being a driver of deforestation in South America. It's important to note that all of these commodities, whether it's soy that's grown in Europe or a cow that's reared in France, these requirements apply universally, as Anna was noting, in terms of just being fair with the World Trade Organization requirements. So you still have to know which cows, which farms were involved in cattle production in Germany and Austria, just as you'll have to know where they are in Brazil or Argentina. So the non-regulated products themselves may not have that direct EU due diligence requirement, but the feed is covered indirectly in that from that downstream customer's perspective, because it's something that the importer needs to still be addressing in what's being brought to market or sourced from even internally to market. So that concentrated trading point, if we go back to kind of our wonderful fish diagram, is just that recognition of there's fewer actors that are involved in it, and they're the ones that should have that visibility in place anyway, because they're the ones that are sourcing it into the market. This SME exemption is really about making sure that there's not, a huge loophole around this. And as Anna noted, there's the possibility that if there's, egregious violations of good practice on the part of an SME, that kind of SME exemption from this can actually be withdrawn. But the core element is still going to be on that first importer, the operator, to provide basic due diligence information, such as there's reference to their own due diligence statement to that customer. It's just that SME doesn't necessarily have a further obligation themselves in terms of having to put out other statements or passing on other types of information that would be required for other businesses. Just on this last point, because I think it's really important to keep in mind that we have to be able to parse what's a legal requirement for businesses versus what's going to be a practical supply chain management requirement for you, because even though your business downstream, if you were a retailer, a product manufacturer, or a brand, may not be to be collecting geolocations for every plot associated with a commodity, if your upstream suppliers have that requirement and they're not doing it and they're not compliant and they get fined, you've got one, the potential for having supply chain disruption, two, this concept of a substantiated concern being raised by anybody could be that you'll have somebody say, we see that this one's a problem, we've notified that importer there, that importer now has a legal requirement to cascade that knowledge down the supply chain. But actually, whilst they're doing that, they're also going to loop around and go to big retailer, big brand, and say, we've connected that company with your supply chain, are they present? And have you done any due diligence on them? And even though it's not a legal requirement, it could be a stakeholder expectation requirement that you've done something in this regard. And again, that something may not be geolocation coordinates, but it may still be that you're just assessing to make sure that your supply chain is resilient and operating accordingly. So that summary around animal feed is just that palm oil and soy is our core ingredients within animal feed. Depending on the livestock product, it can vary, but by virtue of them being regulated commodities, there's going to be some type of requirement. It just may be further upstream from yourself. The importer and non-SME requirements associated with those can be quite substantial, and that's what Anna was running through. And because it applies to all livestock, albeit indirectly, it's every chain that needs to be looked at. It just is essentially, if you're importing something like a chicken, that chicken's not a regulated product, so you don't have to be necessarily looking at its feed and where the chicken was reared right now. But it's very possible that some of these things could be included with the Annex 1 in the near future too, especially when we look at where most of those commodities are actually going. And for something like soy, we know that 60–70% of it is going into pork and poultry supply chains, not beef. So this is something that we just need to be thinking about, but not being too concerned about that geolocation coordinates if you're a downstream customer from buying a livestock product, because that's not strictly a legal requirement. But those additional ones around particularly land tenure and legal production will still be applicable and would certainly be good practice to consider. So that leads us to the point of Anna scaring you and then hopefully pulling back a bit in terms of the requirements and some of the nuances for many people, I think, around livestock, thinking about just, does it mean that you're going to have to go through all these indirect supply chains and get all these geo coordinates? Not strictly within the legislation, but there's ways in which that there's going to be a lot of transparency that's now coming out. So we wanted to conclude just in terms of what it is that you need to do next around this before moving into the Q&A. So first and foremost, for those of you with zero deforestation commitments, which would be a requirement under a science-based target, for example, this isn't going to be a silver bullet solution. It's not about now sitting back saying, we're okay, we've got it all sorted. It's likely that your commitment as a business is more stringent than what the European Union has put forward here. For example, this is strictly about deforestation right now, and it doesn't, and in an earlier draft, it also referenced conversion. That's been stripped out right now. However, the Commission has said that they're going to be looking at bringing it in the future. But for right now, this is a deforestation, not deforestation and conversion regulation. And especially on things like animal feed, it may be out of scope in terms of your business requirements under the EUDR, but it's very much in scope if you've got a zero deforestation commitment as a business. So if we put that to just one side and then recognize these other things, which such as deforestation is going to continue to occur and is occurring today, that is what this legislation is trying to stop. But the EU is a relatively small consuming market. So it's one step in the journey. It's not going to be saying that all deforestation is now addressed because of this legislation. These indirect supply chains previously might have just been voluntarily adopted for responsibility by your business by virtue of a commitment. Even if it's not dealing all across the board with deforestation and conversion, even just for deforestation, it's now saying, well, everybody, it's leveling the playing field. Indirect supply chains need to have something done to them, if at the minimum, just identifying who's actually present within your supply chain. This point around having this substantiated concern can being a trigger is really important because for many of you, we know that there's going to be some people who are just out of the gate, just saying, look, we sent a drone up, we've made this concern here, prove that they're not there in your supply chain. They're already doing that. They've been doing that for years. Civil society groups and investigative journalists and everything, and people who are going out there and looking at trying to see how it is that they connect various ecological crimes or disasters to individual businesses. If they have a substantiated concern and they raise it with you, it then needs to be your company, when you're obligated for in the regulation, that notifies both the authority as well as the downstream customers. And you'll want to be able to say that, one, you've investigated it promptly and you've got a system in place to do that, and two, what actions you've taken as a result of it. But this doesn't happen retrospectively. All of the thing with due diligence is at the point of import, it's legal. So if your system is doing it once a year, once every couple of years, that's not enough for this. You have to make sure that the information is coming through, because when you get a substantiated concern, you have to be able to demonstrate that you've taken all reasonable steps to reduce that risk to a negligible level. So it's not just about monitoring and verification, but also about the governance within your own business. How do you have grievances that are brought in? And what actions do you take from them, and who's accountable for making sure that a system is in place to both minimize the amount of grievances that may be occurring, but also responding to them when they are. So at the end of the day, it's just saying that, it hasn't been a requirement previously for many businesses, other than being voluntarily optional around whether or not they understand where any of these 7 commodities are coming from. That's not an option anymore. And even if it's just identifying who the importer is, or the first importer, so that you can take a look at their due diligence statements, that's really would be, I would say, the minimum level of actions. But for your company, understanding the implications are going to be really important. So know what commodities are present within your business and how they're coming to you. Are any of these regulated commodities actually products that you sell, or are they just ingredients, or perhaps they're just indirectly present through embedded uses? Once you've done that, you'll be able to engage the different parts of your organization to understand who needs to be engaged. And you can start looking at doing that risk analysis and developing a readiness plan in order to understand what actions you need to take between now and the end of 2024, early 2025, to make sure that you're compliant out of the gate. There's clearly a lot of understanding that has to take place both inside organizations as well as within supply chains in preparation for this. Identifying those potential gaps isn't always going to be terribly easy, but it's something that we need to get started on doing now. So if you've got SMEs, that could be, window gaps in terms of how much visibility you have, because you're a regulated non-SME that's still managing one of these regulated commodities, but your direct supplier actually doesn't have the same requirements as the primary operators that do, it's good to identify that earlier on. Understanding that there's traceability gaps right now and will continue to be traceability gaps will be something that you're going to have to deal with, and managing that uncertainty and preparing for that uncertainty. It would be wonderful to be able to turn this around and say that everybody's going to have full visibility if you just asked your supplier for it. That's not the way that it is right now. But the intention of the European Union through this regulation is that it will be that possible in the future to at least say at the point of import, it's been verified, and these are the farms that were part of that shipment. The EU has been quite clear that they're not about having supply chains distinguished. So it's not about saying company A is traceable back to farm B. It's about saying you're traceable to the importer. That importer has provided their full transparency of everything that's been on that shipment, and everything on that shipment has been verified. So as you look further downstream, in terms of how it is that you do it, it might be that there's multiple countries that are coming in. That one boat that stopped in Argentina and then took a pit stop in Brazil and then came here, and all of it's been commingled and mixed together. That's okay for the point of import, provided that everything's been verified at the point of loading. So in summary, you may actually have multiple responsibilities depending upon what it is that you're buying. It could be that you're just bringing in soybeans. You've got edamame on your shelf. It's edamame as a product. In which case there may be a responsibility for you to have that direct commodity mapping that's occurring. And because you're going to have direct responsibility for that regulated product. It could be instead related to just monitoring your supply chain in a regulated manner, which means that you still have to collect their due diligence statement reference numbers and be able to identify them, because you have a linked responsibility to them downstream. And that's going to be the case if you're, a retailer selling chocolate, in which case it has cocoa. You still have this responsibility for that. It's just that it's going to be a bit different because you'll be able to reference these other statements. Now, as Anna pointed out earlier, referencing statements isn't considered due diligence on its own. Just a certification isn't considered due diligence on its own, but they're all things that come together to create a clear package of activities to show that you've taken responsibility for the supply chain. And if you're buying things like chicken, remember the chicken itself is not currently a regulated product, but you may still have that indirect supplier risk. So we've done a bit of a subjective. So, take this for what it is on that. But when we sit around and we talk about, for these 7 different commodities, what's the various degrees of exposure and risk right now, from looking at production traceability, how well is the sector able to identify the farms that are involved in production? How much leverage do downstream customers have in driving change within them? Are there sector initiatives that are being effectively in place to be able to perhaps respond to some of these challenges, particularly around traceability? What about the non-environmental assessments for things like free, prior, informed consent? How well are those working right now? It's not a table full of greens on all of this, and you can see that there's some things that are even further distinguished. So for soy, for human use, it's, well, you know what, you could actually get very good traceability of that right now, and you might have a lot of supply chain leverage because soy is produced in lots of different places in the world. But if you're looking at it for animal feed, your ability to source from different places is largely much more complicated and restricted depending upon where you are in the supply chain. And we may not be seeing any real kind of sector initiatives in place that include various parties to address the fundamental issues that are being covered by the due diligence regulation. So some of them are in better states than others, but in terms of what your supply chain is, you might have more greens on this too, or you might have more reds depending upon where you're sitting. So we've thought about 9 different actions in terms of what it is that you'll need to do here. First of all, if your board isn't aware of this, you need to make them aware. Even if you don't know what your responsibilities are, or you don't think that it's going to be a responsibility, they probably should be informed that this is going on to your risk register and that you've identified it, and that you may or may not have actions to be taking in that respect. Remember that list of products in Annex 1 may and will change over time. So if you're regulated, and I would think that many of you from the commodities that you indicated beforehand may have direct or indirect responsibilities, just getting that briefing together could be an important first step. You then need to make sure that there's governance and ownership of compliance. And we've put this together in order, basically, of a checklist that you can go down rather than a pick and mix of things, because you really need to have each of these mechanics in place. You need the board to be signed on to whatever it is that you're doing and to allocate that responsibility to somebody and have that ownership for compliance. The first thing that you'll then need to do after that is make sure that your policies are updated. Because if you're going to be going to your suppliers and collecting information and you don't actually have a policy for it right now, you may not get anything back because it's not a requirement. If you just say, show us all the ports and the first importers, and they're going to say, well, no, that's cost for us. We don't track that information. Why would we do that? And you don't have any policy or anything to work from. So making sure that your policies are up to date to reflect any requirements that you have or expectations for your suppliers are important, because once you have your policies in place, you can update your supplier contracts to make sure that they're contractually obligated to provide you with various information that might need to come through. Doing all of that then enables you to speak with your commercial and buyers on what requirements they need to be looking for within new supplier contracts and being engaging their suppliers, which is going to come up with a numbers of gaps that you may need to be working through in terms of where there's supply chain capacity building that needs to be implemented. From that point, you can develop a grievance management system and make sure that when you get new complaints or substantiated concerns, that you're able to act upon them. You'll be able to respond. And of course, you'll need to make sure that you've got a monitoring, reporting, and verification process for anything that is coming through, which at the minimum, I would think would include who that first operator is that's bringing the material in, as well as the reference numbers to their due diligence statements. Having all of that done, you can then start looking at the data platforms and system and IT things that you might need to do as a business. It's very simple to start at that point and say, this is a data problem. Therefore, I'll have my team put up a data solution. But if you have rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. And the supply chain right now is not in a position to provide as much information as would be needed for doing due diligence. So making sure that you're spending your time and you're focusing your time and using your capital with suppliers on making sure that they understand what needs to be done is going to be a much better use of time than sending out a questionnaire that asks for a lot of data that doesn't exist right now. So you do need to look at that. It does need to progress. It will take time, but make sure that you've understood your exposure first and you have alignment of what you need within your business before you start just adopting platforms that may or may not be relevant to your organization.
Thanks very much, both Anna and Will, for that. So with the final 10 minutes, we're just going to go through the questions you've sent in, and thanks to everyone for sending in those questions. Hopefully, as we went along, some of the questions that you sent in the earlier stages were answered through both Anna and Will's presentation. But just to start, one question for Anna regarding clarity on what kind of due diligence will be considered good enough. So this notes that there's a variety of data sources for satellite imagery, as there is a variety of traceability granularity that could be considered. So what type of chain of custody is likely to be accepted for certification?
I mean, I think in terms of what's considered due diligence, what's good enough in terms of due diligence, to some extent, that is going to be something that, as the regulation is rolled out, it's going to be defined and tested. So we are expecting that the European Commission will publish guidance around, particularly around sort of data sources. I think already they've, sort of started to mention some of the geospatial systems that are available and that kind of thing. But I think it is going to be, as I say, it's the sort of specification, I suppose, in the regulation is around having sort of adequately verifiable information, using, sort of robust data sources. And I think, sort of demonstrating that there has been that real effort to get that information, using those geolocation coordinates, looking at the different aspects of legality, using the information to verify deforestation. But in terms of exactly what is defined as good enough, then, I think like any legal text, there is unfortunately some space left for interpretation. It is something that probably will be sort of tested and emerge over time.
Great, thanks, Anna. We've one question here that I'll direct to Will regarding geolocation information. So this attendee asks, for a product like beef, will the geolocation of all the farms where those cattle have been housed throughout their entire lifetime be required in the information gathering stage?
So this is something that we are expecting to have further clarity on from the Commission once we get to some of the guidance that's associated with this. I think there are still questions that are outstanding at the moment. It would be expected, I think, that if somebody was doing a traceability or transparency exercise, that you would be trying to go back to all farms that were involved in that cattle production. But this is something that we will need, and as Anna was saying a moment ago, in legislation, there's only what's written, and the reason why you have courts is because people often agree about what's written, and then how that's going to be applied, and that's why you have to have supplemental guidance that's provided as well. So right now, it isn't 100% clear, but it would be good practice to be able to focus your efforts on trying to go back to every stage of cattle production to make sure that you've got those farm coordinates so that you can say for this cow, these are the 3 places that it lived, but before it turned into the product that we have.
Great, thanks, Will. We've had a couple of questions come in regarding differences between the UK and EU legislation. So I'll just direct this to Anna. One attendee asks, this is the EU legislation. When will we know if the UK Act looks the same?
Again, I wish I had the clear answer on this one. So, I mean, the information we've had from the UK government is that obviously under the UK Environment Act, there is a provision to regulate that specifically relates to illegal deforestation rather than all deforestation. But there is still the clear signal from DEFRA that there is that intent to develop regulations in this space, and that is something they're looking at. But they've not provided any information on a timetable for that or exactly where that's going. When we've spoken to DEFRA, they've sort of pointed back to the consultation that was carried out last summer and the sort of official government response that was published to that. I mean, I think one of the things that's, kind of really helpful, I suppose, with the EU regulation is that, in terms of this regulation being a game changer for tackling deforestation, I think, it's not going to work on its own. It's not going to be anything. I think the thing it is going to be a real game changer for is these questions around traceability and transparency down supply chains. And so I think, while we don't know exactly what the UK regulation might look like, and there may well be some differences, some nuances which are interpreted differently, like I say, this question of whether it's all deforestation or only illegal deforestation that's covered. But I think that a lot of the effort that's going to be put into, boosting the transparency down through supply chains, the sorts of data that starts to become, readily available and uniformly available for these commodities, it's going to be a massive shift, I think, in terms of being able to comply with that UK regulation when it does emerge. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a clearer answer on that one.
Great, thanks, Anna. Just before diving into the final few questions, I'm going to launch a quick feedback poll, which would be great to get your participation in while we go through those final questions. I've just launched that there. We've got a question here regarding cattle. So one participant wants to know, in regards to cattle, will this include milk and dairy products? Will, could you take that one maybe?
So the way that the EU has done this is that those wouldn't be regulated products in themselves because they're not in Annex 1 right now. So Annex 1 is very clearly focused on meat and leather. So even other co-products from beef like gelatin, from cows like gelatin, aren't in scope of that. So if that's what you're buying, then the requirement for your business isn't going to be under this from kind of a legal standpoint right now. It would be further upstream. So the dairy farmer may have this, and I think that would be dictated by if they were an SME or not. In themselves in terms of what that responsibility might look like. It could be the feed manufacturer. Again, the feed manufacturer might be an SME too. So it could just be with the importers or processors or feed manufacturers, depending upon where and what they were. But certainly the first company to bring it to Europe as that operator would have the requirement. But downstream, no, I don't think we have to engage, tens of thousands of dairy farmers on this particular issue right now. Because it's being dealt with upstream in terms of where the requirements are.
Great, thanks, Will. In the time that we have remaining here, I'll direct a final question to Anna. One attendee asks, in terms of general legality, as mentioned by Anna for the primary commodity operator, is the EU body planning on defining which laws are relevant according to different countries, Or is it within the responsibility and therefore interpretation of single companies to identify which laws are to be covered, for example, in Brazil?
Yeah, good question. So the legality is defined in terms of the country of production. So yeah, if it's sourced from Brazil, then it would be Brazilian law that would apply. There's sort of specific areas, I suppose, that are focused on in the regulation in terms of what needs to be understood for legality. But I think it would be, that sort of, yes, it is going to be on the operator to understand what the legal requirements were in those places in order to ensure that that legality requirement has been met and that the risks have been reduced down.
Great. So just keeping within time here, we're just about to wrap up. So thank you all for those questions, and hopefully we did manage to cover most of your comments and questions there. We really hope you found the webinar useful. Please do get in touch with us if you have questions. We will be very happy to engage with you on any of the content that's been covered, as well as to discuss implications for your business or future support that we could provide you regarding the implications of the regulation. So thank you again for taking the time out of your busy week to join us, and we hope you have a wonderful day and rest of your week.